I should have known something was wrong the second I saw the flyer. It was stapled crooked to a telephone pole just outside my apartment, edges curling like it had been waiting only for me to notice. Night shift help wanted. Gas station Café. $40 an hour. Cash paid daily. No phone number. No website. Just a crooked arrow scrawled in thick marker pointing toward nowhere. $40 an hour. Too good. Too loud in my head. Rent was overdue. My fridge held a half-empty ketchup bottle and a few wilted lettuce leaves. My car coughed every time I fed it gas. I could feel the eviction notice breathing down my neck. I didn't care if it was shady. At that moment, I would have mopped blood in a morgue for that kind of pay. The cafe sat under buzzing neon at the edge of a forgotten gas station. Rain slicked the asphalt into a black mirror, reflecting the sickly green glow. One letter on the sign had burned out. Instead of Gas Station Cafe, the tubes only spat Gay Saint. A joke maybe. A warning, probably. The bell over the door jingled as I pushed in. Too sharp, too bright, like a dentist's drill pretending to sound cheerful. The air reeked of burnt coffee, bleach, and something metallic under the tile, like pennies left too long in a wet fist. Every stool at the counter was empty. Vinyl cushions cracked with age. The only other soul stood behind the register. Pale guy, early 20s. Wrinkled uniform, hair matted. He looked at me without moving, eyes flat with fluorescent fatigue. "You, Ethan?" I nodded. "Dylan," he said. No smile, no handshake. He turned, expecting me to follow. The break room looked like a place someone had smoked themselves to death in. Walls yellowed by nicotine, tables scarred with burns, air thick with fryer grease that hadn't touched food in decades. But what caught me wasn't the smell, it was the paper pinned above the microwave. A yellowed sheet, corners curled, grease stained by too many hands, typed in fading ink, 10 short lines. The rules: 1. Coffee must never go cold. Keep at least 1 pot brewing. 2. Table 7 is always reserved. Do not seat anyone there. 3. If the red phone rings, answer it. Follow instructions exactly. 4. Sugar dispensers must stay half full. Refill only when told. 5. If the radio plays Blue Moon, hide and stay silent. 6. Do not check restroom camera feed after midnight. 7. If the soda fountain ice bin shakes, unplug it and tape it off. 8. Never let a trucker leave with his mug intact. Break it. 9. For deliveries, leave boxes at the fuel hatch. Knock 3 times. 10. Mr. Rourke may come by. Always say, "Everything's fine, sir." No matter what. I laughed. Too loud in that greasy little room. "So what is this? Hazing? You guys LARPing a creepypasta?" Dylan didn't laugh. Didn't even smirk. He just crossed his arms, stared at me. "Do what it says." His voice flat. "Or you won't last your first shift." The way he said it, like he'd already written my obituary, tightened something in my gut. We took our spots behind the counter. Fluorescents buzzed too loud overhead. The cafe was silent. Too silent. And in that silence, I started hearing things. The fridge motor stuttering like a dying breath. The faint crackle of static from a radio that wasn't even on. The clock above the grill ticking, then jerking back 1 second. Like time itself had hiccuped. That's when I noticed the sugar dispensers. 3 of them, lined neatly on the counter, each one filled halfway, exactly halfway. Not a grain more, not a grain less, surfaces perfectly even, as if measured by something that hated imperfection. Before I could ask, the radio spat half a second of distorted music, like someone turning past a dead channel. Then silence again. My skin prickled. And then, the red phone rang. Not a normal ring. Not cheerful, jagged, metallic. Bert! The sound rattled the napkin holder. The sugar jars trembled, glass chiming like teeth. For a split second, Dylan flinched, shoulders tight, jaw stiff. Then his face reset, blank as stone. My palms pressed hard to the counter. I told myself I wasn't scared. My body didn't believe me. The ringing drilled into bone. Buh, but. Finally, Dylan turned, slow as rust, his eyes unblinking. "You better answer that," he said, and the phone screamed again. The phone didn't stop. Brr, brr. Each blast rattled the glass, crawled through my chest, made my molars buzz. Dylan didn't move, he just stared at me, arms folded, as if this was my exam. I reached for the receiver. Cold plastic, damp, though the cord was dry. The instant I pressed it to my ear, the ringing cut out. No fade, just silence. Silence sharp enough to sting. Then a voice oozed in, not a voice you could map to a throat. More like someone whispering underwater. Syllables stretched, chopped in half by static. Wipe, table 6, clockwise, twice. My stomach dropped. Dylan gave me nothing but a steady stare. Do it. I set the receiver back. The phone sat there, mute, like it had been dead all night, its red casing dull under fluorescent glare. The cafe swallowed the sound as if nothing had rung at all. Table 6 waited under the broken neon. Vinyl booth, empty. The laminate was slick under my palm, cold like a freezer door. Fog bloomed where I touched. Clockwise, I muttered. My voice cracked in the silence. 1 circle. 2. The rag left spirals of condensation. They held, perfectly round. For half a second, it looked like nothing. And then, the circle blinked. I stumbled back, rag slipping from my hand. A pupil stared up at me from the laminate. Iris made of water. It twitched, widened, dilated, drinking me in. Then it rippled apart, dissolving into streaks of damp, until it was just a table again. I turned to Dylan, pulse drilling in my skull. He hadn't moved from behind the counter. He didn't ask what I saw. He didn't need to. Back at the register, he slid me a cup. The coffee was already there, steaming. You did it. His tone was empty, like checking off inventory. I took a sip. The taste jolted me, metallic, sharp, like the pot itself was bleeding iron to keep the brew alive, not coffee. Blood warmed to ritual heat. I swallowed anyway. My throat burned. What the hell was that? I asked. He didn't answer at first. His eyes flicked toward the silent phone, then back at me. That wasn't Rourke on the line. He said it so flat, so certain. It chilled me more than the eye had. For a long time we sat there, the cafe breathing around us, fluorescence humming, cooler wheezing, rain ticking steady outside. The clock above the grill kept twitching. Second hand jerking too fast, then pausing. Like time itself didn't want to stay straight. I wanted to ask Dylan, force him to explain, but the thought twisted my stomach. If he said it out loud, if I made him name it, then it would be real. So I stayed quiet. By the time the sky paled behind the pumps, the table was just damp laminate again. The phone sat red and silent, watching. Dylan drank the dregs of his coffee cold, as if taste didn't matter anymore. My own cup still bit like iron. I told myself it was nothing, just a prank, some trick of condensation. But my hands hadn't stopped shaking, and I knew the voice would call again. I thought the worst was over after that call. I was wrong. It was just past 1 in the morning. For a stretch, the cafe almost felt normal. Rain tapping the windows, the ice machine humming, pumps glowing faint through wet glass. Dylan sat opposite me, arms crossed, eyes half shut. He hadn't touched his coffee. Mine tasted darker with every sip, a metallic bite that clung to my teeth. Then the air shifted. The steady hum of the cooler choked out, like the cafe was holding its breath. I felt a draft on my neck, cold, sour. Only then did I smell it. Burnt, bitter, sharp. Both pots were dark. No steam, no drip, just glass carafes sitting dead. Shit, I muttered, fumbling for the scoop. Coffee grounds spilled over my hands. My pulse jumped so hard I could barely get the filter into place. That's when the scratching started, slow at first. A drag of nail over cinder block. Too deep for rats. Too clean for wires. The sound crept along the wall behind the counter, then spidered outward, under the booths, around the windows, circling the cafe. Another scrape joined it, and another, until it became a chorus. Hundreds of blades raking concrete, building into a metallic scream that made my molars ache. Now, Dylan hissed. He grabbed my arm, dragging me toward the walk-in freezer. The latch stuck, his keys scraped against the lock, metal against metal. Frantic. The scratching grew violent, like claws testing for weak spots, hammering, peeling. My skin prickled. If the latch didn't turn in the next second, Click. The door jerked open. He shoved me in, slammed it behind us. Cold hit like a fist. My lungs burned as I tried to breathe. Frost laced the racks, boxes stacked high with meat and fries. Our breath turned to pale clouds. The scratching didn't stop. It thickened, swarming the walls, circling fast. Something out there was impatient. Through the small glass pane, I saw the coffee machine light flicker. The pump wheezed to life. Drip. The scratching faltered. Drip, drip. Steam hissed. The claws slowed, dragging backward. A few more drops, and silence pressed in. So heavy I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. We didn't move. I dug crescents into my palms. Dylan stood stiff against the rack, his breath fogging in front of him. His eyes never left the glass. Finally, he exhaled. "You see why Rule 1's first?" I nodded, throat frozen shut. When we stepped out, both pots bubbled like nothing had happened. But the walls looked wrong. Not damaged, not scratched, just thinner. The paint stretched too taut, as if covering bone underneath. I refilled our cups with shaking hands. Dylan only held his, never drank. I watched the surface ripple, dark and hot. My own cup seared my tongue. Metallic tang like blood kept warm. Not coffee. Something darker pretending to be. I sipped anyway, and I couldn't shake the thought. Maybe it wasn't just keeping something out. Maybe it was letting something else in, through me. For a while after the freezer, the cafe pretended to be normal. The coffee pots hissed steady. The cooler droned like a tired animal. Rain softened into a mist that silvered the glass and turned the pumps outside into blurry shapes. More suggestion than object. My hands had finally stopped shaking. Every few minutes I checked the burners anyway. Both pots hot, both lights steady. Because now I knew what cold could invite through the walls. 2:02 by the grill clock. I breathed in the familiar smell. Burnt coffee, bleach, and that faint metallic note that clung to the back of the tongue, and told myself the worst was behind us. The radio clicked on. It lived above the shelves, a greasy rectangle half buried in dust. The dial frozen by grime. We never touched it. Now the dial twitched, once, twice, a jittering tremor like a muscle spasm. Then it spun, stuttering across dead stations. White noise spilled out in a slow avalanche. Strings surfaced under the static, warping in and out like they were fighting through water. Blue moon. Dylan didn't look at me. His head snapped toward the sound. Down. Don't breathe, he whispered. Rule 5. I slid off my stool and dropped behind the counter. The tiles cold pressed through my knees. Dylan was already there. Shoulder to shoulder, the smell of fryer oil and laundry detergent ghosting off his shirt. Somewhere in the back, a timer ticked, then thought better of it and died. The music crawled through the cafe slow and syrup-thick, the croon warped vowels smudged by static, like someone dragging a needle across the record's face. Beneath the melody, I felt something else, a low, patient thump, thump, thump. The kind of beat you feel even when you try not to. I risked a look through the narrow gap beneath the register. Out at the pumps, a shadow walked into frame, not cast by any body I could see. It moved under the canopy lights like darkness remembering a shape. Too tall, stretched wrong. Its head skimmed the soffit and made the bulbs flicker. Arms swung past its knees and kept going, elbows bending where elbows shouldn't. The hoses rattled in their holsters as it passed. No wind to blame it on. It paced a slow oval around pump 2. The bass landed. The shadow's foot lifted. The song's bass lifted with it, synced like a metronome. When it set the foot down, the glass of our front door hummed. A soft, sick note I felt in my fillings. Pressure crept into my ears, equalizing like a plane descent. The cafe's air thickened, humid, sour, like fruit left in a trunk through August. I watched its feet because I could watch nothing else. They weren't feet, not really. Elongated hooves of black oil tapering to points. Each step stamped a mark into wet concrete, shining blue under neon. Pigeon-toed, angled inward, wrong geometry, wrong animal. The shadow paused outside our door. Dylan's fingers clamped my wrist like a vice. His nails carved crescents I'd find later. My lungs refused air. I held anyway. The thing leaned, just enough for weight to settle against the glass. The whole frame shuddered, moaned. The radio screamed feedback. The pane bellied inward, a convex swell, like water cupping a hand pressed just shy of breaking. The latch creaked. Metal cried softly. I imagined it opening. The bell jingling its cheerful ring, and that darkness pouring inside to fill the cafe. Thump. The bass landed again. The pane flexed its deepest. Blue neon strobed, died, then came back. The cafe's thin paint pulsed like a heartbeat. The shadow's head tilted. Even that bent the light wrong. I couldn't see a face, but I knew where it would be if it had one. I almost raised my hand to wave. The song cut mid-word. Silence dropped so hard my ears popped. The pane rebounded with a soft ping. The hoses settled in their cradles. Behind us, the coffee machine exhaled a pleased little sigh. Still hot. Still here. We didn't move. Not until my knees ached from crouching. Only when the cooler wheezed back to life did Dylan unclamp his grip. 4 red half-moons burned into my wrist. We stood. Windows showed only our pale reflections, then cleared. The prints remained. Ovals of black oil pacing a perfect ring between the pumps and the door. Some overlapped. Some crossed at angles that made no sense, like it had circled itself, or been 2 places at once. The stains didn't fade. They pooled light. Every tremor of neon made them shiver, like wounds breathing. I pressed my palm to the counter. The laminate was warm. The sugar jars rattled a faint chime as if a truck rolled past a house. 1 grain floated halfway up the glass. Frozen there, defying gravity. I rasped. It saw us. If it saw us, Dylan said, eyes still locked on the door, we wouldn't be having this conversation. His tone curdled my stomach. Blue moon means stay down and shut up, he added. If it ever plays Love Me Tender, you lock everything. Don't ask why. Just do it. He said it like he'd already lived both songs. I poured coffee. Hot felt like safety now. Steam hissed into the mug, metallic edge rising off the pot. Not roast, not coffee, iron. Dylan didn't drink. He just folded his arms. Listening to the radio, now dumb and dead as a stage prop. A semi rolled past on the highway. White glare swept the lot. The black prints didn't fade. They flashed and settled deeper, scars etched into concrete. We waited out the hour standing. I checked burners that didn't need checking, wiped a clean counter, aligned napkins into a perfect square. But the prints never left. They watched. Or maybe I only imagined they did. 2:37. The LED on the security monitor blinked red. The restroom feed. It should have been empty. Sink, fluorescent smear. Door no one had opened. The light blinked twice, then held steady. A red eye glowing, like something behind the camera had finally decided to breathe. Dylan didn't notice. He was still watching the door. I told myself to leave it alone. Rule 6. Do not check the restroom camera after midnight. My thumb had already moved to the zoom. The LED on the monitor kept pulsing, like a heartbeat. Red, red, red. I told myself to ignore it. Rule 6 was printed in thick marker on the sheet Dylan had nailed above the sink. Don't check the restroom feed after midnight. But the button was already under my thumb. The screen fuzzed alive with static, then sharpened. A sick fluorescent wash lit the single restroom. Cracked tile, water-stained ceiling, mirror above the sink, empty. At least, it should have been. My stomach flipped. Someone stood at the sink. Me. Same jacket, same posture, hands on the basin, head tilted down. The other me looked pale, like light had been scraped out of my skin. I was at the register. I knew I was at the register. Yet there I was, staring into a mirror I couldn't see, in a room 10 feet away but impossibly far. Shit, I muttered. The reflection twitched. Its head snapped up. It didn't look at the mirror. It looked at the camera. It looked at me. The monitor buzzed low and electric, like a beehive shaking itself awake. My reflection's lips peeled into something too wide, too late. A smile dragging a beat behind its own face. Dripping filled the speakers, louder than the hum of the cafe. I staggered back. Tell me you didn't. Dylan's voice cut across the counter, cold, steady. But the feed wouldn't let me look away. The other me lifted one hand, slow, deliberate, as if underwater. It waved, drip, drip, drip. Not from the restroom, from the cafe sink. The faucet behind me had started to run. Water spilling steady into the basin. Rule 6. If you look, you wash. You pray. I lunged to the sink, shoved my hands under the freezing stream. Water stunned my fingers until they ached like it had been drawn from a well buried in ice. The dripping on the monitor synced with the splash against my skin. The other me bent forward, too close to the lens. Its eyes gleamed blank. Black static chewing the whites, then its mouth moved, lagging, catching like bad reception. No words, only wet garbled noise like tape being rewound. Shh, I whispered the prayer Dylan had drilled into me. Not mine, not yours, not tonight. My lips clumsy, my breath fogging the faucet. Static surged, the feed warped, tore into white noise. When the picture cleared, the restroom was empty, sink dry, mirror blank, no one there. The faucet in front of me sputtered to silence. Cut off midstream, my hands were red with cold, skin prickled and raw. I turned, chest tight. Dylan was watching, eyes hard, tired. You looked, he said flatly. I couldn't speak. My throat locked, still humming with the echo of that smile. Dylan tapped his cigarette pack against the counter. Not lighting one, just tapping. It's not always you, he added. His voice had dropped low, like he wasn't supposed to say it. Sometimes, it's someone you know. I blinked. What? He didn't answer. He stood, walked into the back. The red LED blinked once more, then winked out. Dead again. The cafe hummed like nothing had happened. Pots hissed, cooler sighed, neon flickered blue across the asphalt. But I couldn't shake the after image burned into my head. The other me waving. Too slow, too late. By 3 a.m., the cafe had gone flat again. Coffee pots humming their steady reassurance. Cooler, grumbling low. Neon bleeding its blue stutter across wet asphalt. After the restroom feed, I should have been grateful for quiet. But silence in this place didn't last. Silence only meant it was waiting. I was wiping down the counter when the first clatter came. A single ice cube jumped in the soda fountain's bin, sharp enough to make me think a rat had dropped in. Then the whole bin rattled. Plastic walls juddered in their casing. Ice leapt like teeth in a shaken jaw. I froze. Dylan didn't. He looked up from the register with that same drained calm he wore like a uniform. Rule 7, he said, already standing. Step back. The noise deepened, not rattling anymore. Voices. Dozens layered, slipping over each other like radio channels bleeding through the same frequency. Anger at first, a mutter of low argument, then sharper, crueler. Words I almost knew but couldn't catch. Consonants scraping like nails inside my skull. I stepped closer, in spite of myself. Cold air licked out of the fountain, sharp as freezer burn. A single cube tumbled onto the tile, skittered to a stop against my shoe. Meltwater smeared oily across the floor, darker than it should have been, as if the cube bled something more than water. Dylan shoved a cardboard out-of-order sign into my hands. The ink faded to pink by time. Unplug it, don't listen. I crouched, yanked the plug. The compressor choked into silence. The voices didn't stop. They rose, arguing, pleading, 1,000 overlapping throats spilling rage through the bin's metal. The laminate under my knees thrummed like it was part of the sound system. My own teeth buzzed against each other. I slapped the sign across the dispenser. Dylan pressed his palm flat on it like sealing a wound. Don't look inside, he hissed. I wanted to ask what happens if you do, but my mouth wouldn't work. The noise pitched higher, then cracked like glass under strain. A chorus of screams burst through the bin, hundreds of them, jagged, desperate. Then cut off, all at once. The silence left behind was heavier than the noise had been. I staggered back, breath ragged. My ears rang with phantom voices still clawing at the edges. Dylan didn't look at me. He watched the out-of-order sign, as though expecting it to peel itself off. You're shaking, I said without thinking. His jaw flexed once. Not enough. He glanced at the unplugged cord, then at the sugar jars on the counter. The grains inside trembled, though the cafe was still. That was when the monitor above the register fizzed, a blink, then a full glitch, lines tearing the feed into gray bands. I looked up, one frame caught. For less than a second, the parking lot was visible, warped, grainy. Pumps bent at impossible angles. The neon signs stretched until the letters blurred, and walking between the pumps, tall, angular shadow stitched out of static, was the thing Dylan hadn't named. The Enforcer. No features, no face, just height that bent the canopy lights into halos, limbs too long for a human rhythm. It didn't pace like the radio shadow, it strode with intent. One arm brushing the pumps hard enough that the hoses swung like pendulums. The screen snapped black. Then normal. A raccoon nosing around the dumpster, oblivious. But my skin hadn't forgotten the frame. Dylan drew a long breath through his nose. Let it leak slow. If you hear the ice talk again, he said, you don't listen. Not for a second longer than you have to. It's how he checks. Who? I asked. He didn't answer. The cafe hummed with its usual machinery, pots hissing, cooler groaning, but my ears were still full of screams that had never really stopped. The out-of-order sign sagged on damp tape, as if it had been soaking up the noise. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Then the red phone rang. The glass jars rattled. The bin twitched once, like it wanted to speak again. Brr. Dylan's eyes went to the phone. Then to me. Answer it, he said, his voice tight for the first time all night. The red phone still throbbed in my ears when the bell over the door chimed. Not the metallic brrr this time, just the soft ding every customer triggered, but it cut sharper than a gunshot. I turned. A man had walked in. He looked wrong before he even reached the counter. Too pale. Skin the shade of paper that had sat under fluorescent light too long. His clothes didn't drip from the storm outside. His shoes left no trace on the tile. He walked straight past me and slid into the booth at the far end. Booth 7. Every muscle in my body screamed. Rule 2 was branded into the paper sheet like a warning carved on stone. No one sits at table 7. If they do, you get 'em out. I swallowed hard. Throat bone dry. Reserved, sir, I called. My voice cracked like I hadn't spoken in hours. The man looked up at me. His eyes were dark in a way that wasn't color, but depth, like I was staring into the mouth of an unlit tunnel. Reserved for whom? He asked. The words dragged, not slurred, delayed, like sound had to crawl uphill out of his throat. He smiled a second after. His lips lagged behind his voice. I couldn't move. My feet were bolted to the laminate. Dylan appeared at my side, sudden, as if the cafe had coughed him up. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just grabbed my wrist and pulled. We're leaving. The man at table 7 tilted his head, too far, like his neck had hinges that weren't human. His eyes tracked us as Dylan yanked me toward the staff exit. Now? Dylan hissed. We stumbled through the back door, out into the narrow service alley that reeked of fryer grease and gasoline. The night pressed in cold and damp. But it was real air, not the vacuum that seemed to suck at the cafe's walls. Behind us, the cafe bell jingled once. Soft, deliberate, we didn't look back. Dylan leaned against the wall, chest heaving. For the first time his mask had cracked. His face slick with sweat. Hand trembling on the handle of his lighter, though he didn't flick it. What was? I started. Don't say it, he snapped. His voice wasn't cruel, but sharp. The edge of someone holding something fragile shut inside. We stayed there, in the stink of grease and wet asphalt, until the horizon bruised gray with dawn. When Rourke showed up, he was calm as ever. Tie knotted, hair combed back. He stepped behind the counter, shuffled through the register receipts, poured himself a cup of coffee. His hand didn't shake. His voice was dry, casual, like nothing unusual had happened. Any problems at table 7? He asked. The coffee sloshed in Dylan's cup, trembling from his grip. I said nothing. My tongue lay thick and numb in my mouth. No, Dylan said finally. Too fast. Rourke studied us. The faintest flicker of amusement curled his mouth. He stirred his coffee, watched the spoon spin. Good, he said. Keep it that way. He walked to the corner, checked the sugar dispensers, tapped the glass once. Each one was exactly half full. He seemed satisfied. The cafe's neon blinked alive again, crackling back into color. Customers would start trickling in soon. Early risers, long-haul drivers, normal life pushing through like weeds and broken asphalt. But my eyes kept dragging back to booth 7. Empty now. Perfectly normal vinyl cushions. Still, I swear I could see the indentation of someone leaning forward. Elbows planted, waiting for me to sit down across from him. The night after table 7, the cafe felt heavier, like the walls knew we'd broken something, just by running. Dylan smoked 2 cigarettes back to back in the alley before our shift. He didn't speak once. By 1:30 a.m. the place was empty again, only the hum of coolers and the drip of coffee. My nerves had just started to loosen when the phone rattled against the wall. I froze. Dylan didn't move. Go on, he muttered finally, not looking at me. I lifted the receiver. The voice was the same underwater static I'd heard before. Stretched syllables, barely human. Booth to Shiwa's coffee. Don't look, keep back turned. Click. The silence after was worse than the sound. Booth 2 was near the window. A woman sat there now, beige coat, soaked shoulders, her hair hung flat, dripping into her lap. I hadn't heard the bell. I carried the pot toward her, each step loud on the tile. My pulse made the room stutter. I didn't look. I couldn't. Rule 3's extension, don't face what calls. I kept my back turned as I set the cup down. The porcelain ticked softly against the formica. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then, breath, right behind me. Wet, steady, rasping, like someone had been swimming too long. My shoulders locked. I poured. Coffee hissed into the cup. My hand shook, the stream splattering. From the chromed surface of the pot I couldn't help it. I saw her. Not her face, her eyes. Hollow sockets rimmed with wet darkness, no pupils, no whites. Her teeth caught the light. Long, sharp, smiling too wide for the face that held them. The reflection trembled in the metal. Behind her, just a blink, something taller loomed. Shoulders scraping the window frame. A shadow I'd started to recognize, the enforcer. I nearly dropped the pot. The stream cut off. The cup was full, or it should have been. But when I risked a glance, heart hammering, the surface was black, glass smooth, not steaming. Empty. The woman rose. The bell over the door chimed, though I never saw her leave. The glass front of the cafe shuddered, like someone had pressed a flat hand against it. For a fraction of a second, another shape reflected there, a silhouette too tall, head bent against the ceiling. Then it was gone. I staggered back, breath tearing through my chest. My apron was damp with spilled coffee. Dylan was at the counter, pale, but motionless. Jaw tight, like he was clenching words he refused to say. That wasn't a customer, I whispered. My voice cracked in the empty room. He finally lit a cigarette, the flare lighting his face. His hands trembled so bad he could barely draw. Outside, the pumps hummed with static that wasn't static, as if the wires underground were dragging something alive through them. The cafe smelled of burnt coffee and rain-soaked wool. Booth 2 sat empty. Cup still in place. The porcelain was dry, spotless, as if nothing had ever touched it. But on the chrome lip of the coffee pot, her reflection lingered 1 beat longer before fading. Smile, last to dissolve. By the 9th night, the cafe didn't just feel wrong. It smelled wrong. It was in the air, like gasoline had threaded itself into every breath. Each inhale coated my tongue with a chemical slick, as if I'd been licking the pumps outside. Dylan didn't speak. He just sat behind the counter, one hand near the red phone, watching it, like it might scream at any second. Shh! But it wasn't the phone that broke the silence. It was brakes, the drawn-out groan of an 18-wheeler, grinding to a stop on wet pavement. Too heavy, too close, too wrong. No fuel delivery had been scheduled. Headlights seared through the front glass, painting the cafe in a wash of white before fading. My heart clenched, part hope, part dread. Maybe Rule 9 was just paranoia. Maybe it was nothing. Then the driver's door opened, and I stopped breathing. The man who stepped down wasn't a man. Reflective vest, boots, gloves, but where his face should have been was only skin. Smooth. Stretched, blank as a sheet of paper. Not a mask. Flesh. In his arms he carried a cardboard box soaked through with black oil. "Fuel hatch," Dylan hissed. His voice was knife-sharp. "Don't let him set it down anywhere else. You have to take it." My body resisted. Knees trembling, hands refusing to rise, but I forced them, wrapped around the slit cardboard. The box was colder than dry ice, a freezing weight that bit through my palms. As I staggered toward the hatch in the floor, every step left slick drops of oil behind me. The faceless driver followed in silence, boots leaving no sound, no mark. At the hatch, I knelt, my breath fogged against the box. Rule 9, 3 knocks, always 3, knock, knock, knock. I held the air in my lungs until my chest hurt. For a moment, nothing. Then, knock, knock, knock. The reply, from inside, the vibration went straight through bone. The hatch rattled under my hands, as if something beneath had pressed upward, eager, hungry. I shoved the box through the opening. The metal slammed shut on its own, like a jaw snapping closed. When I turned, the driver was gone. Not walking away. Gone. No boots striking pavement. No diesel rumble, not even tire marks left behind, only the stink of oil, and the floor gleamed. The oil I dripped hadn't dried, it had spread, thin veins of black connected crawling, shaping themselves into a handprint, 6 long fingers splayed across the linoleum. The sheen pulsed once, as if alive, then stretched toward table 7. My stomach lurched. Dylan muttered words too broken to be prayer. "We're feeding it." The bell over the door chimed. Mr. Rourke stepped inside. He wasn't wet from the rain. His shoes left no drops, though outside the storm still came down in sheets. He didn't acknowledge us, just began his walk, steady, patient, table by table. At each booth he lifted the sugar jars, twisted the lids, peered inside, every single one exactly half full. Perfect. When he reached table 7, he lingered. The 6-finger smear on the floor had already vanished. Sunk into the linoleum, the table stood empty, waiting. Rourke unscrewed the jar, his fingers tapped the glass rim. For a moment the fluorescent light hit his hand, and I saw it. Skin too smooth, stretched too tight, too young. The hand of someone half his age. And then, in the reflection on the glass, I caught more. Not just smoothness. His whole face in miniature, warped by the curve of the sugar jar. Jaw stronger, eyes brighter. Not the worn manager I knew, but a younger mask breathing beneath. I blinked, and it was gone. He screwed the lid back on, turned slowly. His gaze brushed mine, for one beat longer than comfort. "You boys keeping up with the rules?" His voice was light, cheerful, almost. "Yes, sir," Dylan snapped back. "Too fast." Rourke smiled. Not the tired grimace of a man buried under night shifts. This smile was sharper, brighter. A grin borrowed from someone decades younger. "Good," he said. "Keep it that way." The bell chimed once more as he left. The air didn't relax. If anything, the walls felt closer, pressing in. The sugar jars on the counter rattled faintly against the glass tops, though no hand touched them. I couldn't unsee it. The 6-finger print pointing straight to table 7. And Rourke's hand, too young for his body. The words slipped from me before I could stop them. What happens if the sugar's wrong? Dylan didn't look at me. His cigarette tip burned like a tiny warning light. "You don't want to know," he said, but the jars quivered again, chittering, like teeth behind glass. The smell of oil hadn't left since the delivery. It lived under the coffee now, a slick sweetness that didn't belong, like gasoline trying on sugar. The jars still chittered every so often, tiny glass teeth, then fell silent as if embarrassed to be caught. 308 glowed red over the grill. I told myself we'd make it to dawn if we kept the coffee hot and our heads down. The bell over the door chimed, like a normal door in a normal life. He came in shrugging rain off a Yankees cap, mid-40s, weathered, trucker jacket dark with road, knuckles cracked and white with callus. Diesel hung on him the way some men wear cologne. He took the end stool, the one with a wobble in the leg, set his mug down like he'd done it 1,000 times in 1,000 stations. "Top me off," he said, his voice tired, human. The normalcy hit me like heat. "Sure thing," I poured. The pot hissed, steam curled. The metallic tang rode up off the brew, that iron note pretending to be roast. He wrapped both hands around the cup, closed his eyes like he was praying to it. We didn't talk. He drank. I refilled. Dylan watched the window, jaw locked, cigarette unlit between his fingers. Outside, the pumps shone a sick blue in the drizzle. The sugar jars had gone still, half full, perfect halos of white. The red phone detonated against the wall. Bart, Bart, Bart. I jumped. The trucker barely flinched. I lifted the receiver. Cold plastic, damp cord. The voice poured through, underwatery and exact. Syllables snapping like bones said a fraction too late. "Man, at the counter. Must not leave. Keep refilling. If he stands, break his mug." Click. My hand stayed on the receiver a heartbeat after the line died. As if the plastic might anchor me to a safer world. It didn't. I told Dylan. His head moved a millimeter, like the words pushed him back. "No," he said. Soft. Final. "We're not doing that. We don't assault customers because a phone tells us to." "He's going to leave," I whispered. The trucker tipped his cup, eyes on the door, body tilting with the decision. I could feel the moment coming, the way animals feel a storm. Dylan stepped in close, his voice low and furious. "We follow rules that keep us alive. Not this, not..." The chair legs squealed. The trucker stood. He reached for his wallet. The old automatic dance of any traffic-worn man at a counter at 3 a.m. The bell over the door trembled with a breeze that didn't exist. My hand moved before the rest of me made up its mind. I grabbed the mug. For a heartbeat, the weight anchored me. Ceramic, warm, rim greasy from his hands, the heat seeping into my palm. In the rounded reflection I saw myself, distorted and small. A bug on chrome. I smashed it against the edge of the counter. The crack was bright, clean, rung. Shards flew. Coffee fanned across the formica in a brown arc. Steam hissed where it hit my wrist. The sugar jars rattled in sympathy. The trucker froze mid-step. Then he turned. His face lengthened in front of me. It didn't stretch like rubber, it unfolded. Bones clicking into new places you'd think weren't available in a human skull. Cheekbones slid. Jaw unhinged a little too far. Skin grew thin enough to show a fire under it. His eyes lit from the back. No reflection. Just a red glow like taillights buried inside a tunnel. When he grinned, it revealed rows of needle teeth. Wet. Many. Arranged for tearing, not chewing. The air smelled suddenly of ozone and hot dust, like a CRT dying. Every fluorescent in the cafe bowed, humming higher. The radio popped with a static that tasted like pennies. The security monitor tore itself into bands and back. He leaned in, close enough that I saw my own panic reflected in his eyes as two pinpricks of white in all that red. The grin widened, impossibly patient. Then he pivoted and walked out with a liquid ease that made my animal brain want to crawl backward. The bell misrang, a higher, wrong note. The door didn't so much open as the space beside it made room for him. No footprints on the tile, no wet on the mat. He slid into the night like the night had been waiting. Silence piled up in his wake. I realized my fist was bleeding. The mug had opened a line across my palm. It looked black under the fluorescence until a drop hit the counter and came up red after all. Dylan took my wrist, wrapped it in a rag with a pressure that made me see stars. "You shouldn't have done it," he whispered. His voice was shaking. Anger or fear, I couldn't tell. "I should have." "You said..." "I know what I said." He let go, eyes fixed somewhere past me, through the pass-through window to the back office. Sly turned. Something stood in the doorway beyond the stockroom, taller than the frame that tried to contain it. Not shadow, not man. Edges stitched together out of darker dark. Where it moved, the air shimmered, the way heat does over a highway, and the smell of ozone thickened until my tongue went numb. It didn't step forward, it didn't need to. It existed with such pressure, the room obeyed. Fluorescence bent a fraction. The coffee machine's hiss climbed to a teen and held there. My fillings buzzed. The out-of-order sign on the soda fountain shifted, though no air moved. The enforcer watched us. Not with eyes, I never found eyes. With attention. You can feel attention when it's big enough. It weighed both of us like meat on a scale. Something in the walls answered it. Tiny ticks like glass settling. Like sugar remembering how to shake. Dylan didn't breathe. The attention slid off us. Like a knife sliding off bone. The doorway was empty again. The smell receded. The keening dropped back to a hiss. We cleaned in silence. Shards into the bin. Coffee wiped until the counter shone. My hand throbbed in its rag. When dawn pressed a pale smear across the pumps, we stepped outside into air that smelled like rain and old rubber. Anything but coffee. Dylan's car sat under the sign. 4 gouges scored the driver's door from handle to wheel well. Deep. Clean furrows all the way to metal. No paint curled. No debris on the ground. Just 4 perfect lines. As if something too precise to be an animal had tested a hand there. There was a smear in the center of the scratches. Not oil. Not quite. It looked like gasoline remembered as a stain, iridescent, thin, rainbowing in the weak sun. Dylan touched it and flinched as if it bit. "We're not safe anywhere," he said, his voice empty. The bell inside the cafe gave a single, polite ding, though the door hadn't moved. And for the first time, Dylan checked his phone like it might save him. A message preview flashed, Sarah, then vanished as the screen cracked into static and healed smooth again. I didn't say a word. The day shift wouldn't care about any of it, and night would be back in 12 hours, with its rules sharpened. The scratches on Dylan's truck door were still there when we came in for the next shift. He didn't even bother looking at them. He just lit a cigarette. Right under the no smoking by the pump sign, 3 sharp drags, down to the filter. His hands shook the whole time. The cafe's neon hummed above us, flickering the way fluorescent lights do when they're about to die. I told myself it was normal, just dying bulbs. I told myself a lot of things. The red phone rang. Before we'd even clocked in. Not the usual scream, just one long, hollow tone, like someone blowing across a bottle. Dylan looked at me, then at the phone. He didn't move. I picked it up, static first. Then that warped underwater voice. "She's coming, the girl. The one he thinks is his sister, she's not. Don't let her sit. Don't let her drink. The real one waits below." My stomach clenched. Sarah. Dylan had mentioned her before, just in flashes. His little sister back home. The one he worked these night shifts for. The only thing he never joked about. "Say nothing," the voice droned, "or you will both serve." Table 7 waits. Click. Deadline. The bell over the door chimed, and there she was. Or something, wearing her shape. Sarah. Same auburn hair, same denim jacket Dylan once described, but wrong. Her eyes were too flat, too glassy, and when she smiled at Dylan, the expression lagged a second behind, like her face was catching up to the idea of emotion. She walked straight to table 7 and sat, without hesitation. The air in the cafe tightened. Every sugar jar buzzed faintly against the laminate, like teeth grinding. Dylan froze. His lips trembled around her name. "Sarah?" She lifted the empty cup from table 7, tilted it to her lips. Clink, sharp as crystal against crystal, an empty cup ringing like it was full. My skin crawled. I whispered, "Don't look too long," but Dylan was already halfway gone. He staggered toward her, not running, not rushing, just pulled, like his gravity had shifted. His sister, his anchor, sitting right there. I grabbed his arm. "That's not her. She needs me." He hissed. His voice cracked. "She needs me, Ethan." The lights flickered. Table 7 seemed to pulse. Wood bending like wet cardboard. The smile on Sarah's face widened, but her teeth didn't stop where they should have. I did the only thing I could. I bolted for the basement hatch. The lock was ice cold under my hands. It clicked open too easily, like it wanted me down there. I climbed into air thick with fuel fumes and freezer burn. The flashlight beam cut across rows of shelves, old records, boxes marked with years I didn't recognize, and then a face. The real Sarah, bound, pale, but breathing. Her eyes snapped open as the light hit her, wild with panic. She shook her head violently, warning me, not pleading. Behind her on the concrete, old employee ID badges were scattered like leaves, names scratched out, faces gouged. But I knew them. I'd served some of those faces coffee just nights ago. Upstairs, the bell chimed again. The monitors flickered to life on their own, one after another. Every screen showed the cafe above, Dylan standing over Sarah at table 7. And then all the screens twisted to show her face at once. Dozens of Sarahs, all looking straight into the lens, straight at me, her eyes. Wrong. Glassy. Endless. They met mine through the cameras, and she spoke, but not with sound. The speakers stayed dead. Her mouth moved slow, deliberate. "You're already seated." The sugar jars upstairs rattled louder. Teeth on teeth, I clutched one of the dusty ID badges from the floor. Its smile gouged out, the name erased. My own reflection warped across the plastic, and for a second, I swore it wasn't me looking back. Above, Dylan's voice broke into a sob. "Sarah, please." The phone didn't ring this time. It howled, one long metallic moan that made the sugar jars chatter against each other on the counter. Dylan and I just stood there, listening, letting it tear the air apart. When it cut off, the silence was worse. Then the voice came, flat as stone. "One of you stays. Choose." The air itself seemed to wait. I felt Dylan stare, hot, shaking. My throat closed up. My brain started counting rules like rosary beads. Useless and desperate. Coffee hot. Radio low. Don't look. Don't let them sit. Knock back. Never ignore sugar. They spun in my head, like I could bargain with them. The cafe shuddered. The pots hissed, boiling themselves dry. The radio screamed 3 songs at once, each verse grinding against the other until the glass light fixtures rattled. The ice bin clattered, like a coffin being nailed shut. Choose. The word wasn't on the phone anymore. It was in the ceiling, in the floorboards, in my own ribs. I almost said me. My lips cracked open. Maybe if I gave myself, Dylan could walk free. Maybe Sarah could walk free. But then I thought of the basement, the rows of badges, every name smudged, every employee already swallowed. The real Sarah, tied to a chair in the dark. My hand touched my own pocket, like I might already feel the laminate of a badge pressed there, waiting to be crossed out. And I realized the rules had already written me in. My knees gave. I whispered, "It's..." Dylan's hand clamped my shoulder, hard. "No." His voice was sandpaper. "It's me. I'm the one staying." I tried to grab him back, but my arms locked at my sides. It felt like the counter itself had glued me down. My throat ripped out a scream, but the sound died in my chest. The cafe didn't let me stop him. The sugar jars cracked hairlines into glass. The neon over the pumps blew white for an instant, then guttered black. Table 7 yawned open like a throat. The enforcer slid in through the kitchen door, not walking, just arriving. His presence made every fly on the fluorescent tube freeze in midair, like amber. And then, Rourke walked in. For the first time, he wasn't slouched. He wasn't old. His shirt, the same greasy polyester he'd worn for years, shivered into dust at his shoulders. Underneath, skin smooth, pale, stretched tight, his hands on the sugar jar were young, tendons flexing with ease. His eyes, bright and cruel. He smiled at Dylan. On time. Always on time. The glass jar in his grip bled a drop of oil black down the side, then reset itself. Dylan didn't fight when the vortex took him. The booths groaned. Vinyl stretched. The floor split into a spiral. He just looked at me, already half inside the black, and tried to grin. "You'll keep the pots hot," he said. "That's all that matters." The sound that came when he was swallowed was not just a slam. It was steel doors locking. Wet. Final. A reek of hot iron, like blood poured over an engine block, filled the cafe. And then table 7 sealed around him, like a mouth closing on a meal. The cafe reset with a sigh, coffee dripping, radio humming static, sugar jars lined neatly again, untouched. Dylan, gone. Rourke's voice was calm, almost kind. Congratulations, you broke the cycle. That makes you the cycle now. I stumbled back. No, he tilted his young head, mocking. Every job promotes from within. Then he stepped back into the dark. When he was gone, one of the sugar jars on the counter was cracked straight through the middle. It pulsed once, then sealed itself. The bell over the door gave one soft chime. No one had touched it. It sounded less like greeting, more like a timestamp, like the cafe had logged my return.